Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Archibald Hall. Imagine a world of heavy velvet curtains and the rhythmic ticking of a long-case clock in a hallway of polished oak. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax. Outside, a gentle rain taps against the window pane, a soft percussion that matches the steady beat of a heart in hiding. We are entering the quiet realm of the British aristocracy, where everything has its place. In the late 1970s, a shadow moved through these grand houses, a man who had perfected the art of belonging while remaining unknown. He was the perfect servant, a model of discretion, moving through the rooms of the wealthy with the silence of a ghost. To his employers, he was Roy Fontaine. To history, he would become the Monster Butler. Our story begins far from the manicured lawns of England, in the industrial clamor of Govan, Glasgow. In 1924, Archibald Hall was born into a world where luxury was a distant dream. As a boy, he looked at the cold streets and felt a profound disconnect. He was a son of a post-office clerk, but his spirit craved the lace of the elite. By the age of 15, his hunger transformed into a career of larceny. He began with petty thefts, small ripples that would eventually become a tidal wave. Even then, he was a misfit, a boy who dreamed of the grand hotels where an older neighbor had first introduced him to the taste of luxury. He realized early that the world was divided into those who had and those who served, and he intended to master both sides. To shed the skin of a Glaswegian thief, Archibald needed a new name, one that carried the weight of class. He found his inspiration in the theaters of the 1940s, captivated by Joan Fontaine in the film Rebecca. He became Roy Fontaine. The transformation was a total reinvention of his soul. He moved to London, a city of endless possibilities for a man with a silver tongue. In the underground circles of Soho, he refined his walk and his talk. He was a man of many faces, using his charm like a skeleton key to open doors that should have been locked against him. He was comfortable in the presence of the wealthy, mimicking their mannerisms until they were his own. But every key eventually breaks, and Roy soon found himself behind the cold iron bars of prison once again. For many, prison is a place of stagnancy, but for Roy, it was a finishing school. He was a diligent student of his own ambition. Within those walls, he studied the habits of the people he intended to rob. He spent hours in the library, devouring books on antiques and the intricate laws of heraldry. He practiced his elocution, smoothing the rough edges of his Scottish accent until it was replaced by the cultured tones of the English upper class. He learned the exact distance to stand from a dinner guest and the hierarchy of silver on a formal table. By the time he walked free in 1975, he was no longer a common criminal. He was a weapon disguised as a servant, a man who could discuss a Chippendale chair with more authority than the owners. In the late 1970s, the mask was complete. When Roy Fontaine stepped into the service of the aristocracy, he was the picture of reliability. He wore the black jacket of the butler with a pride that bordered on the religious. His shoes were polished to a shine, reflecting the candlelight of the grand dining rooms. He was the man who anticipated every need, the silent hand that refreshed a glass of brandy, the quiet footfall on the stairwell. He possessed a terrifying ability to become invisible, to be present while being entirely ignored by the powerful figures who discussed their secrets in his presence. He was a trusted confidant in a world of traditions. They saw only the white gloves and the bow, never the cold eyes cataloging every piece of jewelry and every gold coin. He stood in the dim light of the hallway, a shadow among shadows. He was waiting, breathing softly in the silence of the great house, for the inevitable moment when the model butler would finally reveal the monster beneath the mask. The stage was set, the silver was polished, and the tragedy was about to begin. He stood in the dim light of the hallway, a shadow among shadows. He was waiting, breathing softly in the silence of the great house, for the inevitable. The year was 1977, a time when Archibald Hall had successfully shed his skin, emerging as the refined and impeccable Roy Fontaine. To the world of the Scottish aristocracy, he was the model of domestic grace, a butler who moved with the quietude of a ghost and the precision of a clock. But the silence of Curdleton House was about to be shattered by a voice from a past he had tried to leave behind. That voice belonged to David Wright. David was a ghost of a different sort, a man Archibald had known in the cold, gray confines of prison. When David arrived at the estate to work as a gamekeeper, he brought with him the scent of the underworld and a reckless disregard for the delicate theater Archibald had meticulously built. The relationship between the two men was a volatile cocktail of shared secrets and simmering resentment. They had been lovers and accomplices, bound by the invisible chains of their mutual criminal history. However, while Archibald sought the quiet dignity of his new persona, David remained a creature of impulse. He was 30 years old, brash, and increasingly dangerous. The friction began almost immediately. David could not help himself. The sight of Lady Hudson's silver and her glittering diamond rings was too much for a man of his leanings. He began to steal, slipping valuables into his pockets with a smirk, knowing that Archibald could hardly report him without exposing his own lies. It was a classic game of blackmail, played out in the hushed corridors of a stately home, where the scent of beeswax and old wood masked the growing rot of betrayal. The tension reached a breaking point on a night thick with the smell of coming rain. Lady Hudson was away, leaving the house in the hands of her trusted butler and her new gamekeeper. David had helped himself to the cellar, consuming no fewer than 6 bottles of expensive champagne. The alcohol did not mellow him, it sharpened his malice. In a fit of drunken rage and entitlement, David confronted Archibald in his bedroom. As the butler lay in bed, the silence was ripped apart by the deafening crack of a rifle. A bullet tore through the air, missing Archibald's head by mere inches and embedding itself deep into the mahogany headboard. David stood in the doorway, the barrel of the gun still smoking, his eyes wild with a mixture of hatred and intoxicated confusion. He jabbed the weapon at Archibald's face, the cold steel a reminder that the past was not just haunting the butler, it was trying to kill him. In that terrifying moment, Archibald did not panic. He was a man who had mastered the art of the mask, and even with a rifle pointed at his heart, he remained calm. He spoke softly, using the soothing, subservient tones of a professional servant to de-escalate the madness. He promised David that they would work it out, that there was no need for such violence between old friends. He managed to coax the gun away and led the stumbling, drunken man back to his own quarters. But as Archibald stood in the dark, looking at the splintered wood of his headboard, a finality settled over him. The decision was made. The butler knew that to save his life and his lies, the gamekeeper had to be removed. He did not feel anger so much as a cold, clinical necessity. The next morning would bring a final, quiet solution to their shared history. The dawn broke over the Scottish borders with a deceptive beauty. Archibald approached David with an olive branch, suggesting they put the previous night behind them and head out for a morning of rabbit hunting on the estate grounds. David, hungover and perhaps a little sheepish, agreed. They walked together into the woods, the damp grass soaking the hems of their trousers. Archibald led the way, guiding his companion toward a secluded spot near a winding stream. He was careful, watching David's every move. He waited until David had fired off his rounds at several rabbits, counting the shots in his head with the patience of a predator. He knew the exact moment when David's rifle was empty. The air was filled with the earthy scent of pine needles and the gentle babbling of the water over the stones, a peaceful backdrop for the violence that was seconds away. As David paused to remark on the beauty of the morning, Archibald stepped behind him. There was no hesitation. He raised his own weapon and fired a single shot into the back of David's head. The sound was a sharp, lonely report that echoed through the trees before being swallowed by the dense foliage. David fell instantly, his body collapsing into the soft earth near the stream bed. The silence that followed was absolute. Archibald stood over him for a long time, watching the steam rise from the damp ground. He felt a strange sense of liberation. This was his first kill, the moment he crossed the threshold from a man of shadows into a man of blood. He spent the next several hours in backbreaking labor, digging a shallow grave in the rocky soil, concealing the body under heavy boulders and a layer of forest debris. He worked with the same meticulous care he used when polishing silver. When the task was finished, Archibald straightened his jacket and walked back toward the house. He was no longer just Roy Fontaine, the perfect butler. He was a murderer, and the weight of that knowledge was a heavy, cold stone in his chest. As he looked back at the woods of Waterbeck, he knew this was only the beginning. The shadows were lengthening, and the path ahead was stained with a darkness that would eventually lead him far from these hills, toward the final silence of a cell near Waterlooville, where his secrets would wait for the thaw. The transition from the estate of Lady Hudson to the service of the Scott Elliots was as seamless as the silk lining of a masterfully tailored dinner jacket. Archibald, still moving under the name of Roy Fontaine, traveled across the rolling, mist-shrouded landscapes of the Scottish borders. In the late autumn of 1977, the air was turning brittle with the coming frost, and the shadows of the hills seemed to stretch longer and darker with every passing day. He arrived at Maryholme, a place where time appeared to have surrendered to the weight of tradition. The stone walls of the estate stood as a silent witness to generations of wealth, and for a man like Archibald, it was a sanctuary. To the world, he was the ultimate professional, a man who spoke in hushed, measured tones and moved with a grace that suggested a lifetime of serving the elite. No one who looked at him saw the coldness in his eyes or the memory of the shallow grave he had left behind in the woods near Waterbeck. To the Scotts, he was simply the answer to their prayers. Walter Scott Elliot was a man of 82 years, a retired politician whose life had been defined by the rigid structures of the British establishment. He was a man of fading strength but enduring dignity, often found draped in heavy wool blankets in the library, surrounded by the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco. His wife, Dorothy, was 22 years his junior, a woman of refined tastes who moved through the high-ceilinged rooms with a quiet, observant presence. They were a couple who valued discretion above all else, and in Roy Fontaine, they believed they had found the pinnacle of domestic service. Archibald understood this perfectly. He knew how to read the subtle shifts in their moods, how to anticipate the need for a fresh glass of water or a warmed plate before a word was ever spoken. He was meticulous, spending hours ensuring that every piece of silver was polished to a mirror-like shine, catching the flicker of the hearth fire in its surface. Life at Maryholme was governed by a precise, rhythmic clockwork. Every morning at 7, Archibald would begin his rounds, the soft click of his leather heels on the parquet floors the only sound in the sleeping house. He would draw the heavy velvet curtains, letting in the pale, gray light of the Scottish morning. He took a strange, dark pleasure in the order he created. There was a power in it, a sense of control that he had lacked during his many years behind prison bars. In this quiet, high-society bubble, he was the architect of their comfort. He curated their meals, managed their correspondence, and became the gatekeeper to their private world. He would stand in the shadows of the dining room as they ate, a silent sentinel who heard every whisper and noted every frailty. To Walter and Dorothy, he was a ghost in a white tie, a servant so perfect he was almost invisible. But behind that mask of invisibility, Archibald was cataloging the treasures of the house, estimating the value of the antique clocks and the heavy gold settings of the family heirlooms. The isolation of the Scottish borders served his purposes beautifully. The estate was surrounded by miles of open moorland and dense thickets of pine, a landscape that felt both grand and claustrophobic. When the wind howled down from the north, rattling the ancient window panes, Archibald would sit in his small, impeccably tidy room and reflect on his journey. He was a man who had reinvented himself a dozen times, but this role felt different. It was a masterpiece of deception. He had studied elocution and etiquette with the same intensity a scholar might apply to ancient languages, shedding his Glasgow roots for the softened, cultured tones of the upper class. He could discuss the nuances of a vintage wine or the history of a piece of porcelain with effortless authority. It was a performance that required constant vigilance. Every gesture, every nod of the head, had to be calibrated to maintain the illusion of the perfect butler, while the spirit of the thief and the killer waited patiently beneath the surface. As the weeks passed into December of 1977, the bond of trust between the Scotts and their butler deepened. They relied on him for everything, from the administration of Walter's medications to the management of their financial affairs. He was even entrusted with signing checks on their behalf, a level of confidence that would have been unthinkable to anyone who knew his true history. He watched the elderly couple with a mixture of pity and predatory interest. They were relics of a vanishing world, fragile and unsuspecting. The quietude of the house was thick with the scent of beeswax and drying flowers, a stagnant atmosphere that Archibald found increasingly suffocating. He began to invite his old associates into his thoughts, planning a score that would finally provide him with the lifestyle he felt he deserved. He wasn't content with just serving the rich. He wanted to possess what they had. The meticulous service he provided was not a path to redemption, but a tactical siege, a way to lower their defenses until the moment was right to strike. There were moments, in the dead of night, when the silence of Maryholme felt heavy with the weight of what was to come. Archibald would walk the perimeter of the house, checking the locks and the bolts, a habit born of a lifetime of criminality. He looked out at the dark horizon, knowing that the peace of the Scott estate was an illusion he had carefully constructed. He was a man of two worlds, the refined world of the butler who poured the tea and the violent world of the man who had shot David right in the back of the head just months before. The contrast between these two identities was a source of dark exhilaration for him. He was the perfect gentleman, the devoted servant, the trusted friend. And yet, as the winter moon cast a cold, silver light over the Scottish borders, he knew that the service he was providing to Walter and Dorothy Scott was merely the prologue to a much darker chapter. The table was set, the silver was polished, and the predator was ready to reveal his true face. The air inside the Chelsea apartment at Richmond Court was always thick with the scent of beeswax and old paper. It was a grand, sprawling space, filled with the treasures of a lifetime spent in the service of the Empire. For Mary Cunning, stepping into the Scott residence as their new housekeeper felt like entering a sanctuary of the old world. The rooms were silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that stood like a sentinel in the hallway. It was 1977, and London outside was a whirl of gray mist and cold rain. But inside, the world was composed of polished mahogany and heavy velvet drapes. Mary was a woman who took pride in the quiet order of a well-run home. She moved through the corridors with a soft tread, her fingers tracing the edges of silver trays and porcelain figurines. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence began to feel less like peace and more like a held breath. The masters of the house, Walter and Dorothy Scott Elliott, were elderly and frail, yet their absence from the daily rhythms of the flat began to weigh on Mary in a way she could not quite name. Archibald Hall, known to Mary only as the impeccable butler Roy Fontaine, was the one who managed the household with a chillingly efficient grace. He was a man of fine manners and tailored suits, his voice a smooth baritone that never wavered. When Mary asked after the Scott Elliots, Roy would offer a thin, practiced smile. He explained that they had gone away for a much-needed rest, perhaps to the countryside or a quiet nursing home to escape the damp London winter. It was a reasonable explanation, yet Mary found herself pausing in the doorways of their empty bedrooms. The beds were made with military precision, the pillows fluffed, the linens white as bone. But there was a coldness that seemed to emanate from the walls. She noticed that Roy was spending a great deal of time behind closed doors with a younger man named Michael Kiddo, a rougher sort who didn't quite fit the polished veneer of the Chelsea address. They spoke in low, urgent whispers that would cease the moment Mary entered the room, leaving a trail of cold air in their wake. The slow burn of suspicion began with the small things, the things only a housekeeper would notice. Mary was intimately acquainted with the inventory of the Scott Elliott treasures. She knew the exact weight of the Georgian silver tea service and the specific gleam of the Indian antiques that Walter prized so dearly. One afternoon, while dusting the high shelves of the library, she realized that a set of gold-inlaid snuff boxes was missing. A few days later, a silk shawl belonging to Dorothy, one that usually draped elegantly over the back of a chaise longue, had vanished. When she mentioned these disappearances to Roy, his composure was absolute. He suggested that the couple had taken several items with them for their travels, or perhaps sent them out for valuation. His words were perfectly logical, yet his eyes remained flat, like two dark stones. Mary began to feel a prickle of heat at the back of her neck whenever he was near. The flat, once a sanctuary, was beginning to feel like a stage where the actors were hiding a terrible truth just behind the curtain. As December progressed, the atmosphere at Richmond Court shifted from uneasy to oppressive. Mary found herself lingering over her tasks, her eyes searching for anything that felt out of place. One morning, while cleaning the hallway near the master suite, she noticed a faint, reddish-brown stain on the edge of a Persian rug. It was small, no larger than a copper coin, but it didn't belong in this world of immaculate surfaces. She knelt to inspect it, the scent of lavender oil on her hands mingling with something sharper, the faint, metallic tang of blood. Before she could investigate further, the shadow of Archibald Hall fell over her. He was standing at the end of the hall, his silhouette framed by the dim winter light. He didn't speak, but the weight of his gaze was a physical pressure. Mary quickly stood, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She made a quiet excuse about a stray thread and hurried to the kitchen, her hands trembling as she filled the kettle. She could feel him watching her, measuring her silence, calculating how much she had seen. Hall's paranoia was beginning to fray his carefully constructed persona. To Mary, the man who called himself Roy Fontaine was becoming a stranger. He paced the apartment late into the night, the sound of his footsteps, a dull thud-thud-thud on the floorboards above her quarters. He was no longer just a butler. He was a man trapped in a web of his own making, and Mary was becoming a loose thread that threatened to unravel it all. She noticed he had begun to move furniture, rearranging the heavy oak cabinets to cover sections of the wall. The air in the flat grew stale, as if the oxygen was being slowly sucked out of the rooms. Every time she reached for a door handle, she wondered if it would be locked, or worse, if it would swing open to reveal something she was never meant to see. The Scott Elliots had been gone for weeks now, and not a single postcard or telephone call had arrived to confirm their safety. The silence of the house had become a scream, and Mary knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the people she served were never coming back. The final realization came on a Tuesday afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the London skyline, casting long, jagged shadows across the sitting room. Mary had been tasked with polishing a set of brass fire irons. As she worked, she overheard a fragment of a conversation between Hall and Kiddo in the adjacent study. They were discussing a car, a journey to the north, and the disposal of heavy luggage. The word shovels was whispered with a chilling casualness that made the blood in Mary's veins turn to ice. She looked down at the brass in her hands, seeing her own distorted reflection, and realized that her presence in the house was no longer a matter of employment, but a matter of survival. Archibald Hall was no longer bothering to hide his agitation. He would stand in the center of the room, his head cocked to the side, as if listening for a voice only he could hear. The mask of the perfect gentleman was slipping, revealing the cold, heartless predator beneath. Mary knew she had to leave, but the front door felt miles away, and the man in the hallway held the only key. As night fell over Chelsea, the apartment became a labyrinth of secrets. Mary retreated to her small room, locking the door and sitting on the edge of her bed, listening to the house breathe. She thought of the Scott Elliots, of Walter's gentle voice and Dorothy's bright silk dresses, and wondered where they truly lay. The discovery wasn't a single moment of clarity, but a mounting pile of evidence that she could no longer ignore. The missing jewels, the strange stains, the whispered plans, and the cold, unblinking eyes of the butler. Archibald Hall was watching the clock, waiting for the right moment to strike again, his paranoia fueling a fire that was quickly growing out of control. Mary realized that the next secret this house would swallow might be her own. The darkness outside the window offered no comfort, only the knowledge that the winter of 1977 was far from over, and the shadows were closing in. The air remained still, the ticking of the clock relentless, as the monster in the tuxedo prepared for his next move. The transition from 1977 into the dawn of 1978 was marked by a chilling silence that blanketed the hills of Cumbria. The festive lights of London had been left far behind, replaced by the skeletal shadows of winter trees and the biting, damp air of the north. Mary Coggle was gone, her life extinguished over a mink coat and the fear of a loose tongue. Her body lay in a lonely stream near Middleby, discovered by a shepherd on Christmas Day, but the world did not yet know the names of the men who had left her there. For Archibald Hall and his companion Michael Kiddo, the holiday season was not a time for reflection or remorse, but a time for consolidation. They retreated to a small, rented cottage in the countryside, a place where the stone walls seemed to absorb the secrets whispered within them. The interior was dimly lit, the orange glow of a peat fire casting long, dancing shadows across the stolen silver and fine porcelain they had pillaged from the Scott Elliot estate. It was here, amidst the quiet crackle of the hearth and the whistling wind outside, that a new figure arrived to disrupt their fragile sanctuary. Donald Hall, Archibald's half-brother, walked through the door, bringing with him a heavy air of unpredictability and a past that Archibald found utterly loathsome. Donald had only recently been released from prison, a man whose life had been a jagged mirror of his brother's criminal tendencies, yet lacking any of Archibald's cultivated polish. To Archibald, who now preferred the name Roy Fontaine and the refined manners of a high-society butler, Donald was a reminder of a gutter-born reality he wished to bury forever. There was a profound friction between them, a biological bond stretched thin by years of mutual distrust and fundamental differences in character. Archibald looked at his brother and saw a man who was crude, reckless, and deeply unsettling. Donald's reputation as a sex offender preceded him, a fact that Archibald found morally beneath even his own murderous standards. As they sat together in the cramped confines of the cottage, the air grew thick with a tension that no fire could warm. Donald was far too curious, his eyes constantly darting toward the expensive items scattered around the room. He began to ask questions, prying into how a humble butler and his friend had come into possession of such wealth. He sensed the underlying violence of their recent weeks, and rather than being repelled, he seemed eager to lean into the danger, unaware that he was walking directly into a trap set by his own blood. The days in early January were short, the sun barely rising over the horizon before the gray veil of evening returned. Inside the cottage, Archibald and Kiddo maintained a veneer of hospitality, but behind closed doors, a dark consensus had been reached. Donald was a liability. He knew too much, he talked too much, and his presence threatened the meticulous world Archibald was trying to build. Archibald began to see his brother not as a person, but as a stain that needed to be cleansed. He spoke softly with Kiddo in the shadows of the kitchen, their voices low as they orchestrated a plan that was as cold as the frost on the window panes. They decided to play on Donald's own criminal ambitions, telling him they were planning a major robbery, a tie-up job that would require precision and practice. They invited Donald to participate, suggesting that they needed to rehearse the binding of a victim to ensure everything went smoothly. Donald, perhaps fueled by a desire to prove himself to his more successful brother, agreed with a dark laugh. He did not see the exchange of looks between Archibald and Kiddo, nor did he notice the small glass bottle that Archibald had quietly retrieved from a locked chest. The atmosphere in the cottage shifted into something surreal as the rehearsal began. The light from the single lamp flickered, throwing distorted shapes against the walls. They asked Donald to sit in a chair, and with practiced ease, they began to secure his limbs with rope. It was a macabre game, a performance of domesticity turned inside out. Donald joked about the tightness of the knots, his voice echoing in the small room. But as the final rope was cinched, the mood turned leaden. Archibald stepped forward, his expression a mask of professional calm. In his hand, he held a cloth soaked in chloroform. The scent was sickly sweet, a chemical cloying that filled the lungs and clouded the mind. As Donald realized the game was over, his eyes widened with a sudden, frantic understanding, but he was already immobilized. The cloth was pressed firmly over his nose and mouth. The struggle was brief, the frantic muffled sounds of a man fighting for air slowly giving way to a heavy, drug-induced limpness. The silence that followed was more profound than any that had come before, broken only by the heavy breathing of the two men standing over the unconscious form of Archibald's brother. With the cold efficiency that had become his trademark, Archibald led the way to the bathroom. The sound of water running into the tub was loud in the stillness of the cottage, a domestic sound repurposed for a final, grim utility. The water was not warm. It was as biting as the streams outside. Together, Archibald and Kiddo lifted the unresponsive body of Donald Hall and carried him into the small, dimly lit room. There was no hesitation in their movements. They lowered him into the water, ensuring his head was submerged. Archibald watched with a detached, clinical gaze as the life departed from his brother. There was no flicker of fraternal love, no moment of hesitation before the end. To Archibald, this was merely a necessary piece of housekeeping, a way to ensure that the secrets of the 1977 spree remained hidden. He waited until the last of the movement stopped, until the water in the tub became perfectly still, reflecting the flickering bulb above. The act was finished. Donald Hall, the final victim of the Monster Butler's internal circle, was dead. But the problem remained of what to do with the evidence of their latest crime. The night air was freezing as they dragged the body out to their car, a Ford Granada that Archibald had recently acquired. He had a strange superstition about the car's original registration plates, which contained the numbers 999, a sequence he believed was unlucky. In a move that would ultimately prove to be their undoing, he had replaced them with false plates, failing to realize that the tax disc on the windshield still bore the original, correct numbers. They heaved the body into the boot, the metal lid closing with a dull thud that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground. Their plan was to drive north, back toward Scotland, to find a remote place to dispose of Donald just as they had with the others. As the engine turned over, cutting through the silence of the Cumbrian night, the two men felt a sense of dark relief. They believed they were moving toward freedom, unaware that the very car carrying their secret was already a beacon for the law. The road ahead was slick with ice and hidden by a gathering snowstorm, a white shroud that would soon bring their journey and their reign of terror to a crashing halt in the small town of North Berwick. The tires of the Ford Granada crunched over the frost-hardened earth as the vehicle pulled away from the site of their previous grim task. Archibald Hall sat behind the wheel, his hands steady, his mind already drifting toward the next phase of his grand design. For a man who lived in a world of silver trays and polished mahogany, the transition to the dark, freezing outskirts of the city felt almost natural. He had always been a creature of two worlds, the refined upper crust of London society and the cold, calculating depths of the criminal underground. But as the winter of 1977 deepened, those two worlds were beginning to bleed into one another in ways that even Archibald could not have predicted. The shadows were growing longer, and the targets were becoming more prestigious. The focus of his attention now rested on the elegant residence of David and Mary Scott Elliott. David, a man of 84 years and a former member of Parliament, lived a life of quiet luxury in the heart of Chelsea. His wife, Mary, was 82, and together they represented the very essence of the British aristocracy that Archibald so desperately craved to inhabit. To the outside world, Archibald was the perfect butler, a man of impeccable manners and invisible presence. He knew the precise temperature at which the tea should be served, the exact angle of a dinner plate, and the silent rhythm of a household at rest. But beneath the starched collar and the polished shoes, he was cataloging their wealth, counting the pieces of fine porcelain and measuring the weight of their silver. He wasn't just serving them. He was preparing to dismantle their lives piece by piece. The plan began to spiral on the night of December 8, 1977. Archibald had invited his accomplice, Michael Kiddo, into the apartment while the elderly couple was supposedly occupied. They were standing in the middle of the drawing room, surrounded by the opulence of the Scott Elliott estate, discussing how they would strip the place bare. The air was still, broken only by the low hum of the city outside and the ticking of a grandfather clock. Suddenly, the heavy oak door creaked open. Mary Scott Elliott stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with confusion and rising fear as she found her trusted butler in deep conversation with a stranger. The mask of the perfect servant shattered in an instant. There was no time for silver-tongued excuses. Kiddo acted with a brutal, reflexive speed, lunging forward to silence her before she could scream. The peaceful Chelsea flat was suddenly transformed into a theater of violence. In the struggle that followed, Mary was overcome. A soft pillow was used to stifle her cries, and within minutes, the vibrant life of the 82-year-old woman was extinguished. The silence that returned to the room was different now. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Archibald looked down at the body of the woman he had served only hours before, but he felt no remorse, only the cold prickle of logistical necessity. He realized that the disappearance of one spouse would immediately alert the other. And so, the plan evolved from a mere robbery into a complex, multi-day performance of deception. They needed to move her, but they also needed to manage David, who remained in another part of the house, unaware that the woman he had loved for decades was now a secret hidden within his own home. The following morning, Archibald presented himself to the elderly David with his usual composure. He spoke softly, explaining that Mary had simply gone out for an early shopping trip. To further the ruse, Archibald brought in Mary Coggle, a woman known in the underworld as Belfast Mary. She was a hardened character, a far cry from the aristocratic Mary Scott Elliott, but under Archibald's direction, she donned a wig and an expensive mink coat belonging to the deceased woman. From a distance, or through the hazy vision of a confused 84-year-old man, the deception held. David, already fragile and increasingly disoriented by the subtle administration of sleeping pills and whiskey, accepted the presence of this stranger as his wife. It was a haunting masquerade, a dance of ghosts performed in broad daylight as they prepared to leave London behind for the desolate landscapes of the north. The journey that followed was something out of a nightmare. The Ford Granada was loaded with the couple's belongings, and more chillingly, the body of Mary Scott Elliott was concealed in the boot. In the back seat sat David, heavily sedated and drifting in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring to the woman in the mink coat whom he believed to be his wife. They drove for hours, leaving the orange glow of the city lights for the deep, ink-black darkness of the Scottish Highlands. The heater in the car hummed a monotonous tune as they crossed the border. Archibald watched the road ahead, his eyes fixed on the horizon, while the winter wind began to howl against the glass. They were moving toward a place where the earth was frozen solid, a place where secrets could be buried deep beneath the heather and the snow. Upon reaching a lonely, wind-swept spot in Perthshire, they made their first stop. The ground was like iron, resisting the bite of the shovel as they worked to create a final resting place for Mary. The physical labor was grueling, the air so cold it burned their lungs, but Archibald pushed through with a mechanical determination. Once the earth had claimed her, they continued their journey further north with David. He was a man out of time, a living obstacle in the way of Archibald's ultimate freedom. When they finally reached the remote woods near Tomich, the charade ended. There, in the bitter stillness of the Highlands, the elderly man was taken from the car. He was confused, weak, and unable to comprehend the betrayal of the man who had stood at his shoulder for so long. The end came swiftly, a scarf, a struggle, and the final heavy thud of a spade. The Scots had vanished, replaced by a void that Archibald and his companions hoped to fill with stolen wealth and forged identities. The Chelsea flat stood empty, a house of shadows where the dust would soon begin to settle on the fine china and the unread letters. Archibald had successfully removed the obstacles, but in doing so, he had woven a web of violence so intricate that the threads were beginning to tighten around him as well. The quiet of the Highlands offered a temporary sanctuary, but the cold of that winter was unrelenting, and the echoes of the Scots' final moments seemed to linger in the whistling wind. The butler had finished his service, and the house was finally, terrifyingly still. The transition from the velvet-lined silence of the Chelsea flat to the freezing air of the London streets was the first step in a logistical nightmare that would span hundreds of miles across the spine of Britain. Archibald Hall and Michael Kitto moved with a clinical, hurried focus, their breath blooming in the night air like pale ghosts. The physical weight of their crimes was no longer a theoretical burden, but a literal one, manifesting in the heavy, awkward shape of a body wrapped and destined for the dark. They loaded the boot of the car with a grim efficiency, the metallic thud of the lid closing marking the end of their time in the city. The city lights of 1977 began to recede in the rearview mirror, replaced by the encroaching shadows of the open road and the long, monotonous stretch of the motorway that led toward the Scottish border. The vehicle they chose was a tool of deception as much as transport. Within its cramped confines, a surreal theater of the macabre unfolded. While Dorothy Scott Elliott lay still in the darkness of the boot, her husband, Walter, sat in the back seat, his mind clouded by a heavy fog of drugged whiskey and sleeping pills. Beside him sat Mary Coggle, draped in Dorothy's own expensive mink coat and a carefully styled wig, playing the role of a living wife to a man too far gone to recognize the imposter. This was the logistics of their escape, a moving tableau of the living and the dead traveling north at 60 miles per hour. The hum of the tires on the asphalt provided a rhythmic backdrop to the suffocating silence inside the cabin, where every mile gained was a mile further into a wilderness where they hoped their secrets would be swallowed by the earth. As they crossed into the northern reaches of England, the landscape began to shed its urban skin. The familiar glow of orange street lamps gave way to an ink-black darkness that seemed to press against the windows of the Ford. The drive was a test of endurance, 400 miles of constant movement through the biting winter chill of late December. Archibald steered the car through the winding passages of the one road, his eyes fixed on the narrow corridor of the headlights. The logistics of disposal required more than just distance. It required a total isolation that only the rugged terrain of the Scottish Highlands could provide. They were heading toward Perthshire, a region of deep forests and ancient stones, where the ground was hard with the first grip of a winter frost that made every breath a struggle and every movement a labor. The first stop was near the quiet village of Bracco. Here, the physical reality of their task became truly grueling. The ground was not welcoming. It was a frozen shield of soil and roots that resisted the bite of the spade. Under the cover of darkness, with only the rustle of the wind through the pines to witness them, Hall and Kiddo labored to create a shallow grave for Dorothy. The sound of the shovel striking the earth was sharp and rhythmic, a lonely percussion in the vast silence of the Perthshire night. They worked in shifts, their muscles aching and their fingers numbing in the sub-zero temperatures. Once the earth finally gave way, they moved with a frantic haste to hide the evidence, covering the site with layers of damp leaves and bracken until the forest floor looked undisturbed to any casual observer passing by in the morning light. But the journey was far from over. The logistics of the night demanded further travel, deeper into the highlands where the mountains cast long, intimidating shadows over the glens. They drove toward the remote beauty of Glen Affric and the woods near Tomich, carrying the 82-year-old Walter Scott Elliot to his final, lonely destination. The air here was even thinner and colder, the silence so profound it felt heavy. In this isolated spot, the charade finally ended. The brutality of the act was matched only by the bleakness of the surroundings. After Walter was gone, they used the same spade, now caked with the mud of 2 different counties, to bury him beneath the towering trees. The physical toll on the 2 men was visible in their sunken eyes and trembling hands, yet they were driven by a desperate, cold adrenaline that pushed them back toward the car and away from the graves they had dug. The final logistical hurdle of this dark expedition involved the disposal of Mary Coggle, whose presence had become a liability as she clung to the stolen mink coat. Near the border at Middleby in Dumfriesshire, they found a quiet stream flowing beneath a stone bridge. The water was black and fast-moving, silvered only by the occasional flash of moonlight. Here, they discarded the last witness to their northern trek, letting the cold current take what was left of their camaraderie. As January 1978 dawned, the men found themselves exhausted, their clothes stained with the earth of the highlands, and their car carrying the invisible weight of the departed. They believed that by spreading the evidence across hundreds of miles of wilderness, they had woven a web too complex for any investigator to untangle. They turned the car south once more, leaving the silence of the glens behind, unaware that the very logistics they had mastered would soon become the trail that led the world straight to their door. January 15th, 1978. The coastal air of North Berwick was a blade of ice, cutting through the heavy wool of overcoats and the rattling steel of car doors. The town, usually a sanctuary for summer travelers seeking the salt-crusted beauty of East Lothian, was now a desolate landscape of gray stone and frozen slush. Inside a rented Ford Granada, the atmosphere was suffocatingly heavy. Archibald Hall sat behind the wheel, his knuckles white as he navigated the treacherous, snow-dusted roads. Beside him, Michael Kiddo remained a silent, twitching shadow. Behind them, locked in the darkness of the boot, lay the rigid remains of Donald Hall, Archibald's own half-brother. They had been driving for hours, searching for a place where the earth was soft enough to accept another secret, but the winter had turned the soil into iron. The world was closing in, and the exhaustion was beginning to erode the careful composure Hall had spent a lifetime perfecting. The blinding swirl of a snowstorm eventually forced their hand. They could not continue toward the highlands in such visibility without risking an accident that would bring the law directly to their bumper. Hall pulled the car to a stop in front of the Blenheim House Hotel, a dignified establishment standing on the north side of the high street. To any passerby, they appeared to be nothing more than two weary travelers seeking refuge from the gale. As they stepped out of the vehicle, the wind whipped at their tailored suits. Hall, ever the performer, adjusted his tie and smoothed his hair, assuming the persona of Roy Fontaine once more. He was immaculately turned out, a man of apparent means and impeccable breeding. He signaled for Kiddo to follow, his eyes casting a final, lingering look at the rear of the car, where the frost was already beginning to lace the edges of the trunk lid. Inside the hotel, the warmth was immediate, carrying the scent of floor wax and old wood. The proprietor, a man named Norman Wright, stood behind the mahogany reception desk. He watched as the two men approached, noting the sharp contrast between their elegant attire and the desperate weather outside. Hall spoke with a refined, melodic lilt, introducing himself and his companion. He spun a narrative of a sentimental journey, a final tour of the Scottish countryside before Kiddo was to fly off to a new life in Australia. It was a charming story, delivered with the practiced ease of a professional butler, yet as Hall signed the guest register, Norman Wright felt a flicker of unease. There was something in the way Hall's eyes didn't quite match his smile, a coldness that seemed deeper than the January frost. The hospitality was offered, but the intuition of the hotelier had already begun to stir. They moved to the bar, where Hall ordered a Dubonnet and lemonade. He was calm, almost too calm, as he leaned against the counter and engaged in polite conversation. However, the small details began to bleed through the facade. Hall insisted on paying cash for a bottle of wine to accompany their dinner, a gesture that felt overly deliberate to the observant Wright. It wasn't just the cash, but the way Hall handled it, with a certain flashy precision that didn't sit right in a quiet seaside hotel. Outside, the Granada sat under the glow of a street lamp, its dark paint becoming obscured by a fresh layer of white. It was during this time that another guest, or perhaps a member of the staff, noticed a faint, discordant odor near the vehicle. It was not the scent of salt or gasoline, but something thick and sweet, a cloying heaviness that shouldn't have been there in the freezing air. The car was a silent witness, its false license plates hiding a truth that was literally beginning to rot. Norman Wright's suspicion crystallized around a very practical concern. He began to worry that these two overly polished men might be high-level con artists who intended to slip away in the dark hours of the morning without settling their account. The bill would not have exceeded £25, but it was enough to prompt him to take a closer look. He stepped out into the biting wind to inspect their car. Beneath the layer of snow, he noticed the license plate. Hall had recently changed them because the original set contained 3 9s, a sequence he superstitiously believed brought bad luck. But in his haste, he had neglected a vital detail. When Wright compared the registration number on the plates to the tax disc displayed on the windshield, they did not match. The discrepancy was a jagged crack in the carefully constructed image of the refined gentleman. To Wright, this wasn't just a potential skipped bill. It was the mark of a criminal. The hotelier returned to the warmth of the building and quietly picked up the telephone. He didn't call with news of a murder. He called the local police to report a suspicious car and the possibility of a fraudulent stay. As Hall and Kiddo sat in the dining room, enjoying their meal and perhaps feeling a false sense of security, the law was already on its way. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the lobby seemed to grow louder, marking the final minutes of a killing spree that had spanned months and claimed 5 lives. When the constables arrived, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The polished manners of Archibald Hall were put to the ultimate test as the officers asked to see his identification and the keys to the vehicle. The mask was about to slip for the final time. The smell of decay from the trunk was no longer a ghost in the wind. It was about to become the primary evidence in a chamber of horrors that would leave the quiet town of North Berwick forever changed. The night of January 16th, 1978, was draped in a suffocating mantle of frost that seemed to steal the very breath from one's lungs. In the seaside town of North Berwick, the wind whipped off the Firth of Forth, carrying with it the sharp, salty sting of the North Sea. Inside the Blenheim House Hotel, the air should have been heavy with the comfort of wood smoke and the quiet hum of a winter evening. But instead, it was thick with a rising, invisible tension. Archibald Hall and Michael Kiddo sat in the lounge, perhaps nursing their drinks, still wearing the impeccable suits that had allowed them to glide through the upper echelons of society. They were the image of refinement, of silver-tongued gentlemen on a leisurely journey through the Scottish landscape. But outside, parked in the bitter shadows, sat the Ford Granada, a silent vessel carrying a secret so dark it threatened to shatter the frozen stillness of the night. The hotelier, a man of keen observation named Norman, had felt the wrongness of them from the start. It was not just their manner, which was a touch too polished, but a nagging suspicion about their ability to pay the bill. He had reached for the telephone, not out of a fear for his life, but out of a simple, pragmatic concern for £25. That one small act of caution was the pebble that would trigger a massive, unstoppable avalanche. When the two police constables, Michael Webster and Charles Turner, arrived at the hotel, they did not come with sirens or flashing lights. They stepped into the warmth of the lobby, the snow melting off their heavy woolen greatcoats, their boots echoing on the floorboards. To them, this was a routine call, a check on a couple of potential grifters who might skip out on a lodging bill. Hall, ever the performer, met them with his practiced, aristocratic charm. He spoke with the measured tones of a man who had spent years as a high-society butler, a man who knew exactly how to navigate the egos of those in authority. He offered no resistance, only a smooth, cooperative smile that suggested this was all a very minor, very unfortunate misunderstanding. The officers, however, were trained to look past the velvet veneer. They asked about the car parked outside. The green Ford Granada was a fine vehicle, but when the constables glanced at the registration plates, something didn't quite align. Archibald had been meticulous about many things, but a streak of superstition had led him to change the plates. He believed that the original numbers, which contained 3 nines, were a harbinger of ill fortune. In his attempt to escape a perceived curse, he had invited a much more tangible doom. The plates on the car were registered to a completely different vehicle, a humble white Ford Escort. The discrepancy was enough to justify a trip to the police station. It was only a short distance, perhaps 200 yards down the high street, a walk that should have taken mere minutes through the biting air. Hall and Kiddo were escorted out of the hotel. The transition from the golden light of the lobby to the blue-black darkness of the Scottish winter hitting them like a physical blow. The street lamps cast long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones, and the only sound was the rhythmic crunch of snow under their feet. Archibald walked with a composure that was almost haunting, his mind likely spinning through a dozen different escape routes, a dozen different lies. He knew what was in the boot of that car. He knew that just inches away from the officer's hands lay the body of his own half-brother, Donald, cold and bound in the trunk. The irony was suffocating. The man who had murdered for diamonds and status was being brought down by a mismatched tax disc and Atelier's £25 anxiety. As they reached the small, local police station, the air seemed to grow even colder, the silence of the town pressing in on them, waiting for the truth to be unearthed from the frozen metal of the Granada. Inside the station, the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer a polite inquiry in a hotel lounge. It was the sterile, unforgiving light of an official investigation. While Michael Kiddo was held in one area, the officers turned their attention to the vehicle. They moved back out into the night, their torches cutting through the darkness like pale yellow swords. When they reached the rear of the car, the metal of the boot was slick with ice. One of the officers inserted the key, the lock turning with a heavy, metallic click that must have sounded like a gunshot to Archibald, waiting inside. As the lid was lifted, the beam of the flashlight fell upon a sight that no small-town constable was prepared for. There, amidst the shadows of the trunk, lay the body of Donald Hall. He had been tied up, his life extinguished by a chloroformed rag and the cold calculation of his own kin. The discovery transformed the night instantly. What had begun as a petty fraud investigation had blossomed into a horrific murder inquiry. The officers felt the weight of the moment, the realization that they were standing over the fifth victim of a spree that spanned the length of the country. The frost on the body sparkled in the torchlight, a grim, beautiful detail in a scene of absolute depravity. Archibald Hall, sensing the shift in the air even from within the station walls, knew that his masks had all finally slipped. But he was a man who had spent a lifetime escaping, from poverty, from prison, and from the consequences of his own soul. With a cunning that never quite left him, he requested to use the lavatory. It was a simple, human request, one that the officers granted in the chaotic minutes following the discovery in the car. Once alone in the small, cramped room, Hall didn't hesitate. He assessed the window, a narrow opening that looked out into the freezing darkness. For a man in his 50s, he moved with a desperate, wiry strength, squeezing his frame through the frame and dropping down into the snow-covered alleyway beyond. He didn't feel the cold as he hit the ground. He felt only the surging adrenaline of the hunt. He vanished into the shadows of North Barrack, a ghost in a bespoke suit, disappearing as the alarm was raised behind him. He scrambled through the frost-heavy gardens and back streets, his breath coming in ragged gasps that hung in the air like white smoke. He was a predator turned prey, running through a landscape that had become a frozen labyrinth of his own making. His flight led him to a taxi, a bizarre detail in an already surreal night. He hailed the driver, spinning a tale about a wife who had been in an accident, a story delivered with such desperate conviction that the driver began to traverse the winter roads for him. For 3 long hours, as the police set up roadblocks and the news of the discovery began to ripple through the authorities, Archibald Hall sat in the back of that cab, watching the dark Scottish hills roll past. He even insisted on paying the full fare, a final, flickering spark of the gentleman butler persona he had inhabited for so long. But the net was closing. The police had cordoned off the arteries of the region, and at a roadblock in nearby Haddington, the journey finally reached its end. As the officers approached the taxi, the flickering blue lights reflecting off the ice, Hall knew there were no more windows to climb through, no more aliases to adopt. He was no longer Roy Fontaine, the sophisticated companion of the wealthy. He was Archibald Hall, and the trail of blood he had left from London to the Highlands had finally led the world to his door. As he was taken back into custody, the snow continued to fall, softly covering the tracks of his final, futile pursuit through the frost. The sirens that once tore through the Scottish night have finally surrendered to a heavy, expectant silence. Archibald Hall is now behind bars, but his presence lingers like a cold draft in a locked room. As the morning of January 18th, 1978, begins to bleed across the horizon, the focus shifts away from the chase and toward the quiet, frozen reaches of the landscape. The investigation is no longer a pursuit of a living man, but a search for those he left behind. The air is brittle, a sharp crystalline cold that catches in the throat and turns every breath into a pale, fleeting ghost. For the detectives and forensic teams, the task ahead is one of somber excavation. They are moving toward the places Hall described in his confession, locations where the earth has been forced to keep secrets it was never meant to hold. The luxury of the Scott Elliott world, once filled with fine silks and the soft clink of silver, has been replaced by the harsh reality of the winter elements. Imagine the scene as the police caravans arrive at the first site near Brocco in Perthshire. The ground here is a solid sheet of iron, buried under a thick, unforgiving layer of snow that has fallen steadily over the past several days. The trees stand like skeletal sentinels, their branches heavy with ice that crackles softly in the wind. There is no warmth here, only the rhythmic crunch of heavy boots breaking through the frozen crust of the earth. The forensic teams move with a deliberate, haunting slowness. They are dressed in heavy parkas, their hands gloved against the biting wind as they begin to mark out grids upon the white expanse. Probes are pushed into the snow, seeking any resistance that might suggest the ground beneath has been disturbed. It is a grueling, physical process, a battle against a landscape that seems determined to remain frozen in time, protecting the grim truth buried beneath its surface. As the sun climbs higher, though offering little heat, the work intensifies. The investigators use heaters and small, controlled fires to soften the topsoil, a necessary step before any trowel or spade can penetrate the frost. The smell of damp earth and wood smoke begins to mingle with the clean, sharp scent of the winter air. There is a specific kind of tension in this work, a silence shared by men who know exactly what they are looking for, but dread the moment they find it. They are looking for Dorothy Scott Elliott, a woman of 60 years who had vanished into the shadow of her own butler. Every inch of soil moved is a step closer to answering the questions that have haunted the past few months. The soft scraping of metal against frozen stone is the only sound, a lonely percussion in the vast, white emptiness of the Perthshire countryside. Suddenly, the rhythm changes. A spade strikes something that isn't stone or root. The investigators drop to their knees, switching to smaller brushes and hand tools. With infinite care, they begin to peel back the layers of icy mud. The earth slowly yields, and the first sign of a shallow grave appears. It is a heart-wrenching sight, the realization that a life of such status and history ended in a hole barely deep enough to shield it from the wind. As they clear the debris, the form of Dorothy is revealed, preserved by the very cold that made the search so difficult. There is an overwhelming sense of tragedy in the way the forensic light glints off the remnants of her clothing, a stark contrast to the dark, wet soil. The team works in total silence now, out of a profound respect for the woman who had once moved through the high society of London with grace, now found in a lonely patch of Scottish woods. But the work is far from over. The map of Hall's crimes extends much further north, into the wild and rugged beauty of Glen Affric. The journey there takes the team through winding mountain passes where the snow drifts are even deeper, reaching several feet in height. This is where Walter Scott Elliott, the 82-year-old former member of Parliament, was said to be resting. The isolation of this place is staggering. Towering pines and jagged peaks surround a landscape that feels ancient and indifferent to human suffering. The investigators must navigate the treacherous terrain, carrying their equipment through the drifts. The wind howls through the glen, a mournful sound that seems to echo the violence that occurred here. They search near the base of a great tree, where the ground is slightly sheltered, but no less frozen than the sites before. When they find Walter, the brutality of his end becomes undeniably clear. Unlike the quiet stillness of the previous discovery, the evidence here speaks of a desperate struggle. The ground yielded not just a body, but the physical remnants of a crime committed with a spade, a tool meant for gardening, turned into a weapon of murder. The forensic detail is chilling. The way the soil has packed into the indentations of the earth, the way the old man's frame was positioned in his final moments. The investigators document every inch, their cameras clicking in the frigid air, the flashes of light momentarily illuminating the dark hollows of the glen. It is a grim inventory of a life stolen, recorded with a cold, clinical precision that serves as the only possible response to such madness. As the bodies are carefully recovered and placed into waiting vehicles, the thaw of hidden truths continues. The search is not just for the victims, but for the scattered pieces of their lives that Hall tried to erase. In the surrounding areas, investigators find discarded items, a piece of jewelry here, a monogrammed handkerchief there, objects that once held sentimental value, now reduced to evidence tags and plastic bags. The contrast is jarring, the beauty of the highlands serving as a backdrop for such calculated cruelty. By the time the sun begins to dip below the mountains, casting long blue shadows across the snow, the weight of the day's work settles heavily on the team. They have reclaimed the lost, but the peace of the estate has been forever altered. The secrets that Hall buried in the frost have been brought into the light, and though the ground remains cold, the truth has finally begun to breathe. The investigation moves forward, leaving the frozen glens behind, carrying the silent testimonies of the dead back toward the halls of justice. The air inside the Old Bailey in November of 1978 was thick and still, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old radiators and the heavy weight of silence. Outside, the London sky was a bruise-colored gray, but inside the courtroom, the world seemed to shrink to the polished wood of the dock where Archibald Hall sat. He was a man who had spent a lifetime perfecting a mask, a man who had carefully curated an image of refinement and class. Even now, facing the ultimate reckoning for his deeds, he remained meticulously groomed, his posture straight, his expression an inscrutable shield of aristocratic calm. It was a strange sight to behold, a man accused of such visceral, jagged violence appearing as though he were merely waiting for a formal dinner to begin. The contrast was a final, chilling performance from a person who had lived his entire life as a character of his own invention. The legal proceedings had been split between two countries, a reflection of the wide, dark path Hall and his accomplice had carved across the landscape. Earlier that year in May, they had stood before the High Court in Edinburgh. There, the details of the deaths of David Wright and the elderly Walter Scott Elliot were laid bare. The court listened in a stunned hush as the narrative of the rabbit hunt in the Scottish borders was recounted, the empty gun, the cold betrayal, and the shallow grave by the stream. The details of Walter Scott Elliot's final moments were equally harrowing, involving a shovel and a lonely spot near Glen Affric. In that Scottish courtroom, Hall had been handed 2 life sentences, but the law was not yet finished with the man the press had begun to call the Monster Butler. There were more names to be spoken, more lives that had been snuffed out for the sake of silver spoons and silk ties. When the trial moved to London for the murders of Mary Coggle and Archibald's own half-brother, Donald, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The evidence presented was a collection of tragic artifacts, a blood-stained poker, a mink coat that Mary had refused to relinquish, and the chilling account of a bathtub in a holiday cottage where a brother's life was taken. The prosecution painted a picture of a man whose greed was so absolute that it had eroded every human connection he possessed. The judge, looking down from the bench with a gaze as cold as the winter outside, did not mince words. He noted Hall's cold-blooded behavior and his clear leadership in these dreadful matters. The recommendation was absolute. Archibald Hall was to serve a whole-life tariff. He was told, in a voice that echoed through the rafters, that he should never be considered for parole. He was to spend the rest of his natural life behind the high, gray walls of a prison cell. For the next 24 years, the man who called himself Roy Fontaine became a ghost within the British prison system. The world outside transformed. The 1970s faded into the 80s, and the digital age began to dawn. But for Hall, time was measured in the rhythmic clink of keys and the slow passage of light across a stone floor. He spent his days in quiet reflection, or perhaps in further invention. In 1999, he published his autobiography, titled A Perfect Gentleman. Within its pages, he tried once more to control the narrative, describing his life as a series of grand adventures and sophisticated cons, though he finally admitted that there was a side of him that was cold and heartless. He spoke of his desire for death, making several attempts to end his own life, as the reality of a life without an audience began to settle into his bones. The man who loved the finer things was now surrounded by the starkest of realities. By the time the year 2002 arrived, Archibald Hall was one of the oldest prisoners in the country. He was 78 years old, his body finally beginning to fail where his resolve once stood firm. In September of that year, while being held at Kingston Prison in Portsmouth, he suffered a stroke. The end came quietly, far from the grand estates and the glittering jewels he had once murdered to possess. There was no fanfare, no final dramatic monologue. He died of natural causes, a frail old man whose name had long ago become a footnote in the dark history of British crime. The victims he had tried to erase, David, Walter, Dorothy, Mary, and Donald, remained in the memory of the law, while the man who had sought to live forever in the lap of luxury passed into the silence of the earth. The masks were all gone, leaving only the memory of the lives he had taken. As we look back on this long, winding journey from the streets of Glasgow to the courtrooms of London, the details begin to soften. The sharp edges of the evidence, the coldness of the Scottish snow, and the glitter of stolen diamonds all start to recede into the distance. We have walked through the shadows of a man who wanted to be someone else so desperately that he destroyed everything in his path. But now, that path has come to an end. The stories are told, the sentences are served, and the restless spirits of the past can find their peace. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom have closed for the final time, and the lamp on the host's desk is dimmed. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.